The autumn rain had stopped, just as Detective Inspector Colin Hayes parked his unmarked police car near the gates of Buckingham Palace. His hands trembled slightly as he turned off the engine, the weight of his service weapon heavy against his side. 48 hours had passed since his world collapsed, and now he sat staring at the iconic red-coated guards. Through his rain-streaked windshield, Colin had been a police officer for 18 years, rising through the ranks with a reputation for integrity and dedication. His colleagues respected him, his superiors trusted him, and the community knew him as someone who genuinely cared about justice. But all of that meant nothing now, not after what he had discovered in the evidence locker 2 days ago. The corruption ran deeper than he had ever imagined. Senior officers, prosecutors, even judges were involved in a network that had been operating for years. Drug money, witness intimidation, evidence tampering. It was a web of corruption that reached into every corner of the justice system he had sworn to serve. And when Colin tried to report it through proper channels, he learned the most devastating truth of all: there were no proper channels left. His own superintendent, a man Colin had considered a mentor, was at the center of it all. The phone call that morning had been brief and terrifying. His family was in danger. His career was over. His life as he knew it was finished. The message was clear: stay quiet, or face consequences that would destroy everything he held dear. But Colin Hayes was not a man who stayed quiet when faced with injustice. The problem was that every official avenue had been compromised. Internal affairs, the Crown prosecution, service, even his union representatives, they were all part of the system that had betrayed everything he believed in. There was nowhere to turn, no one to trust, and time was running out. That's when he remembered the guards at the palace. They answered to a different chain of command, one that remained untouched by the corruption plaguing his department. They served the Crown directly, their loyalty absolute and their integrity unquestionable. If anyone could be trusted with the evidence he carried, it would be them. The crowd of tourists moved slowly past his car, their cameras and phones capturing the pageantry of the changing of the guard ceremony. Families pointed excitedly at the soldiers in their distinctive red tunics and tall black hats, completely unaware that among them sat a desperate man carrying information that could topple some of the most powerful people in British law enforcement. Lance Corporal William Foster stood at attention outside the palace gates, his Lee-Enfield rifle held with practiced precision. At 26, he had already served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been selected for ceremonial duties based on his exemplary service record. The tourists fascinated him. Their joy and excitement at witnessing something he performed every day reminded him of why his service mattered. But William's training extended far beyond ceremonial duties. He was a combat veteran, trained in counterterrorism and threat assessment. His eyes constantly scanned the crowd, looking for anything that didn't belong, anyone whose behavior seemed unusual or potentially dangerous. It was during one of these routine scans that he noticed the man in the unmarked police car. Colin finally stepped out of his vehicle, his police identification clearly visible on his belt along with his warrant card. He appeared to be just another officer on duty, but William's instincts told him something was different. The man's movements were too tense, too purposeful for casual patrol work. His eyes held the look William had seen in combat zones, the expression of someone operating under extreme stress. The detective approached the palace gates with determined steps, his hand instinctively checking the envelope of documents in his inside pocket. These papers contained bank records, recorded conversations, photographs, and witness statements that could bring down dozens of corrupt officials. But getting them to someone who could act on them was proving to be the most dangerous mission of his life. As Colin drew closer to the guard position, William maintained his ceremonial stance, while internally preparing for whatever was about to unfold. The crowd continued their tourist activities, completely unaware that they were about to witness something far more dramatic than any changing of the guard ceremony. Colin approached the ceremonial position where William stood, his police credentials clearly visible, but his behavior increasingly erratic. The crowd of tourists began to take notice as the detective's pace quickened and his voice carried across the courtyard. Several people raised their phones, initially thinking they were about to capture an interesting interaction between law enforcement agencies. "I need to speak with you," Colin called out to William, his voice strained with urgency. "It's a matter of national security. Lives are at stake." William maintained his ceremonial posture, trained to ignore distractions and disruptions during his duty, but his combat experience allowed him to assess threats while appearing completely focused on his traditional role. The approaching police officer exhibited classic signs of extreme stress: rapid breathing, excessive sweating despite the cool weather, and movements that suggested barely controlled panic. The detective reached into his jacket pocket, causing William's muscles to tense imperceptibly. Years of military training had taught him to be ready for any situation, even while maintaining the appearance of ceremonial stillness. The tourists continued photographing, unaware that they might be documenting something far more serious than a routine guard duty. Colin pulled out his warrant card and held it toward the guard, speaking more urgently now. "Detective Inspector Colin Hayes, Metropolitan Police. I have evidence of corruption that reaches the highest levels of government. My superiors are compromised. I need to get this information to someone who can act on it." The desperation in his voice was unmistakable, and several tourists began to step back, sensing that something unusual was happening. Mother pulled her young son closer while an elderly couple exchanged worried glances. The festive atmosphere of the ceremonial area began to shift toward uncertainty and concern. William's training included protocols for dealing with various types of disruptions, but this situation fell outside normal parameters. The man appeared to be a legitimate police officer in genuine distress, but his behavior was becoming increasingly unpredictable. The guard's responsibility was clear: maintain security while protecting both the public and the integrity of his position. Colin's frustration grew as the guard remained silent and motionless. In his deteriorating mental state, he interpreted the lack of response as dismissal, or worse, complicity. The paranoia that had been building over the past 48 hours began to overwhelm his rational judgment. Everyone seemed to be against him, even those he had hoped might help. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice rising. "They killed Detective Sarah Morrison because she was going to expose them. They threatened my family. There's nowhere else to turn." The mention of a killed police officer caught the attention of nearby security personnel who had been monitoring the situation from a distance. Palace security operated under strict protocols, but the combination of an armed police officer exhibiting signs of mental distress and claims about murder created a potentially explosive scenario. William processed the information rapidly. Military experience included dealing with traumatized soldiers and civilians in high-stress situations. He recognized the signs of someone who had been pushed beyond their breaking point. But he also understood the potential danger such individuals could represent two innocent bystanders. The crowd was growing larger as word spread through the tourist groups that something unusual was happening. Phones were recording from multiple angles, and social media posts were already beginning to appear with hashtags about drama at the palace. The situation was escalating beyond anyone's ability to contain it quietly. Colin's hand moved toward his service weapon, not with aggressive intent, but as a gesture of desperation. He wanted to prove his identity, to show that he was a genuine police officer with legitimate concerns. But to the trained eye of the Royal Guard and the security personnel watching from nearby positions, any movement toward a weapon represented a potential threat that required immediate assessment and possible response. The detective's next words proved to be the catalyst for everything that followed. "If you won't listen to me, maybe you'll listen to this." His hand closed around the grip of his service pistol, intending only to display his official status, but creating a moment of crisis that would test everyone's training and judgment. The moment Colin's hand touched his pistol grip, the entire dynamic of the situation changed. William's combat instincts engaged fully, his body shifting almost imperceptibly into a defensive stance while maintaining the appearance of ceremonial duty. The guard's years of military training compressed into split-second decision-making as he assessed threat levels, escape routes, and potential casualties among the civilian crowd. Colin drew his service weapon slowly, holding it by the barrel, to demonstrate that he meant no harm. But to the dozens of tourists watching and recording, the sight of a police officer brandishing a firearm near the royal guard created immediate panic. Screams echoed across the courtyard as people scattered, parents grabbing their children and running toward the palace gates and nearby streets. "Please," Colin pleaded, his voice breaking with emotion. "I just need someone in authority to look at these documents. My own department is compromised. They're going to kill me for what I know." William's response was measured and professional, despite the chaos erupting around them. His voice carried the calm authority developed through years of military service. "Sir, I need you to place your weapon on the ground and step back. We can arrange for you to speak with the appropriate authorities through proper channels." The proper channels were exactly what Colin feared most. His paranoia, fed by days of genuine threats and discovery of widespread corruption, made it impossible for him to trust any official process. In his mind, everyone in uniform was potentially compromised. Everyone in authority was potentially an enemy. Palace security personnel were now moving into position, their own weapons drawn, but held low and ready. The lead security officer, Inspector Michael Torres, had 20 years of experience dealing with various types of incidents at royal venues. He could see that the police officer was in genuine distress rather than posing a calculated threat. But protocol demanded treating any armed individual near the royal family's residence as a potential terrorist. The crowd had largely dispersed, but several tourists continued filming from safer distances. The footage would later show the remarkable restraint demonstrated by all the security personnel involved. But in the moment, the situation appeared to be spiraling toward potential tragedy. Colin's hand shook as he held the pistol, his finger carefully away from the trigger. Military and police training had ingrained proper weapon safety into his muscle memory, but his emotional state was deteriorating rapidly. The weight of the corruption he had discovered, the threats to his family, and the apparent impossibility of finding help were crushing his ability to think clearly. Detective Morrison found out about the drug money, he continued, tears streaming down his face. She was going to expose Superintendent Williams and all the others. They made it look like a car accident, but I have proof. I have recordings, photographs, bank records, everything. William processed this information while maintaining his defensive posture. His military experience included dealing with informants and intelligence gathering in combat zones. The detective's claims, while delivered in a highly emotional state, contained specific details and names that suggested genuine inside knowledge rather than delusion or fabrication. Inspector Torres spoke into his radio, coordinating with additional security units while trying to de-escalate the situation. His training emphasized the importance of giving distressed individuals a sense of being heard while maintaining safety for all involved parties. The challenge was creating an environment where Colin could surrender peacefully without feeling that he was being silenced or eliminated. The detective's next action surprised everyone. Instead of threatening anyone with his weapon, he turned it around and placed the barrel against his own temple. The crowd's scattered screams intensified as people realized they might be witnessing a suicide attempt rather than a terrorist attack. "Won't let them silence me," Colin declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard with heartbreaking clarity. "These documents need to reach someone who can act on them, someone who isn't part of their system." William's military training included crisis intervention and suicide prevention techniques learned during his service with troubled veterans. The situation had evolved from a potential security threat to a mental health emergency requiring completely different tactics and approaches. The sight of Colin holding the pistol to his own head transformed the entire situation from a security threat into a humanitarian crisis. William's military training in crisis intervention took precedence over ceremonial protocol as he slowly began to move from his rigid guard position, speaking in the calm, steady voice he had used to help traumatize soldiers in Afghanistan. "Detective Hayes," William said, using the man's name to establish personal connection. "I can see you're carrying a heavy burden. Let's talk about this properly. Your information is important, and there are people who can help you get it to the right authorities." Colin's hand trembled as he held the weapon against his temple, years of police firearms training warring with his emotional desperation. The crowd that remained was silent now, watching in horrified fascination as the drama unfolded. Several people had called emergency services, and the distant sound of sirens could be heard approaching the palace grounds. Inspector Torres coordinated with his team while maintaining a respectful distance. His experience with disturbed individuals taught him that crowding someone in Colin's mental state could trigger the very action they were trying to prevent. He spoke quietly into his radio, ensuring that approaching emergency responders understood. They were dealing with a suicidal police officer rather than a terrorist threat. "They killed Sarah," Colin continued, his voice breaking. "She was going to testify about the drug seizures that never made it to evidence. Millions of pounds just disappeared, and when she started asking questions, they eliminated her. I have her backup files, recordings of meetings, everything." William took another small step forward, his movements slow and non-threatening. His experience with post-traumatic stress among his military colleagues had taught him to recognize the signs of someone whose world had collapsed around them. Colin wasn't a criminal or a terrorist, he was a good man, broken by discovering evil within the system he had devoted his life to serving. A negotiation specialist from the Metropolitan Police was en route, but William understood that every second counted when someone was in Colin's mental state. The guard's combat experience had taught him that sometimes immediate human connection was more valuable than waiting for official experts to arrive. "Your evidence matters," William said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced life-and-death situations. "But it only matters if you're alive to see justice done. Detective Morrison would want you to survive this to make sure her death wasn't in vain." Colin's eyes met William's for the first time, and something in the guard's expression seemed to penetrate through his despair. Here was someone who understood duty and sacrifice, someone whose loyalty was beyond question. The ceremonial uniform represented centuries of unwavering service to crown and country, untouched by the corruption that had infected civilian law enforcement. "I tried to go through proper channels," Colin said, his voice slightly calmer now. "Internal affairs, the Crown Prosecution Service, even my union representatives. They're all compromised. There's no one left to trust, except—" He gestured toward William with his free hand. "Except maybe someone whose oath is to something bigger than departmental politics." The approaching sirens were getting closer, but William knew that the arrival of more police officers might trigger Colin's paranoia again. The detective's trust had been completely shattered by discovering corruption among his colleagues, and seeing more uniforms might convince him that he was about to be silenced permanently. Inspector Torres made a crucial decision, ordering the approaching police units to maintain their distance and allow the Royal Guard to continue his intervention. It was an unprecedented breach of normal protocol, but the situation demanded flexibility and trust in the judgment of the person who had established the best connection with the distressed detective. "I need you to do something for me, William," said, taking another careful step forward. "I need you to place that weapon on the ground so we can focus on getting your evidence to people who can act on it. My commanding officer has direct access to intelligence services that operate independently of your department." Colin's hand began to lower slightly, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in days. The possibility that his information might actually reach people with the power and independence to act on it was the lifeline he had been desperately seeking since discovering the extent of the corruption surrounding him. The tension in the courtyard was palpable as Colin slowly began to lower his service weapon. William's words about independent intelligence services had penetrated through the detective's paranoia and despair, offering the first glimmer of hope he had felt since discovering the extent of the corruption within his own department. "You're talking about MI5?" Colin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "People who answer directly to the security services rather than the Home Office?" William nodded carefully, maintaining eye contact while continuing his slow approach. "There are channels that exist specifically for situations like this, detective. People whose job it is to investigate corruption in sensitive positions. But they can't help you if you're not alive to provide testimony." The crowd had been moved back to a safe distance, but phone cameras continued recording from behind security barriers. The footage would later show the remarkable patience and skill demonstrated by the Royal Guard in what had become an impromptu hostage negotiation, where the hostage and hostage-taker were the same person. Colin's hand shook as he finally placed the pistol on the ground and kicked it away from his position. The moment the weapon was secure, Inspector Torres and his team moved forward with practiced efficiency, but William raised a hand to slow their approach. The detective was cooperating now, but his mental state remained fragile. "I have copies of everything," Colin said, as he slowly raised his hands to show he was no longer armed. "Bank transfers, recorded conversations, surveillance photos. Detective Morrison documented everything before they killed her. She knew they were coming for her, so she gave me backup copies of all her evidence." Medical personnel who had been standing by quickly assessed Colin's condition, while William remained close to provide reassurance. The detective had not slept properly in days, had barely eaten, and was showing clear signs of severe stress and exhaustion. But physically, he was unharmed and no longer posed a danger to himself or others. Inspector Torres coordinated with his superiors, while William explained what Colin had revealed during their conversation. The claims about police corruption, murder, and compromised investigations would need to be handled by specialized units with the authority and independence to investigate such serious allegations, as Colin was being helped by paramedics. Gripped William's arm with surprising strength. "Promise me," he said urgently. "Promise me this won't disappear into the same system that's already been corrupted. Detective Morrison died because she believed in justice. Her evidence needs to reach people who can act on it." William looked directly into the desperate man's eyes and made a commitment that went beyond his ceremonial duties. "I give you my word as a soldier and a guardsman. Your information will reach the appropriate authorities through channels that operate independently of your department. Detective Morrison's sacrifice won't be forgotten." The crowd began to disperse as the immediate crisis passed, but many continued discussing what they had witnessed. Social media was already buzzing with speculation about the dramatic scene at the palace, though few of the observers understood the full significance of what had transpired. Colin was transported to a secure medical facility where he could receive proper care while his claims were investigated. The envelope of documents he carried was formally transferred to Inspector Torres under strict chain of custody protocols, ensuring that the evidence would be preserved and properly examined. Within hours, copies of Detective Morrison's files were in the hands of investigators from the security service, who operated completely independently of the Metropolitan Police hierarchy. The evidence was extensive and detailed, containing information that would eventually lead to dozens of arrests and the exposure of a corruption network that had operated for years. William returned to his ceremonial duties, but the morning's events had affected him profoundly. His military service had taught him about honor and sacrifice, but he had never expected to encounter such dedication to justice from a civilian police officer who had risked everything to expose corruption. Within his own ranks, the tourists who witnessed the incident would remember it as one of the most dramatic and emotional scenes they'd ever observed. But more importantly, they had seen an example of how training, compassion, and genuine human connection could transform a potential tragedy into a moment of hope and redemption. As the day progressed and normal tourist activities resumed around the palace, the impact of Colin's desperate action was already beginning to ripple through the highest levels of law enforcement and intelligence services. 6 months after the dramatic confrontation at Buckingham Palace, the ripple effects of Colin Hayes' desperate action had transformed the landscape of British law enforcement. The evidence provided by Detective Morrison's files had led to the largest police corruption investigation in decades, with over 40 officers arrested and an entire network of criminal activity exposed. Colin sat in the Witness Protection Program facility, preparing for another day of testimony in what had become known as Operation Clean Sweep. His appearance had changed dramatically. He looked healthier, more rested, and carried himself with the dignity of someone whose faith in justice had been restored. The months of investigation had vindicated everything he had risked his life to expose. Superintendent Williams, the man Colin had once considered a mentor, was now serving a 20-year sentence for murder, drug trafficking, and corruption. The accident that killed Detective Sarah Morrison had been proven to be a carefully planned assassination, and William's network had been systematically dismantled by investigators from multiple agencies. William Foister had been quietly commended for his role in preventing what could have been a tragedy while facilitating one of the most important police corruption cases in British history. His commanding officers recognized that his actions had gone far beyond ceremonial duties, demonstrating the kind of judgment and compassion that exemplified the best traditions of military service. The Royal Guard had maintained regular contact with Colin throughout the investigation, serving as a liaison between the detective and the various intelligence agencies handling the case. Their initial meeting in crisis had evolved into a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. On a quiet Tuesday morning, William was granted special permission to visit Colin at the secure facility where he was staying during the trials. The two men met in a small conference room, a conversation observed by security personnel, but conducted with the privacy appropriate to their relationship. "I wanted to thank you personally," Colin said, shaking William's hand with genuine warmth. "Not just for saving my life, but for keeping your promise. Sarah's evidence reached the right people, and her killers are facing justice." William nodded, still somewhat uncomfortable with being praised for what he considered simply doing his duty. "You were the one who took all the risks, Detective. Could have stayed quiet, protected yourself and your family. Instead, you chose to stand up for what was right." Their conversation revealed how both men had been affected by their encounter. Colin had discovered that there were still people in uniform who could be trusted, that the corruption he had uncovered was an aberration rather than the norm. William had learned that sometimes the greatest act of service involved breaking protocol to help someone in desperate need. The media coverage of Operation Clean Sweep had been extensive, though Colin's identity remained protected throughout. The proceedings, the viral video of the palace incident, had been viewed millions of times, many people commenting on the professionalism and compassion demonstrated by the Royal Guard. In dealing with a man in crisis, Detective Morrison had been posthumously awarded the Queen's Police Medal for her courage in investigating corruption despite personal risk. Her family attended the ceremony, finally able to understand why she had been killed and to see that her sacrifice had not been in vain. The Metropolitan Police had undergone massive reforms as a result of the investigation, with new oversight, procedures, and independent monitoring systems, designed to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had flourished under William's leadership. Several other police forces around the country had also implemented similar reforms as a precautionary measure. As their visit concluded, Colin handed William a framed photograph of Detective Morrison, along with a letter from her family thanking him for his role in bringing her killers to justice. The image showed a young woman in police uniform smiling with the confidence of someone who believed in the system she served. "She would have been proud to know that her evidence reached someone who would act on it," Colin said. "She would have been grateful that there are still people like you who understand that duty means more than just following orders." William returned to his ceremonial duties that afternoon, but the photograph found a place of honor in his quarters. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought not on foreign battlefields, but in the pursuit of justice and truth within their own society. The tourists who continued to visit the palace and watch the changing of the guard ceremony had no idea that one of the guards they photographed had played a crucial role in exposing police corruption and preventing a suicide. To them, it was simply part of the pageantry and tradition that made their visit memorable. But for those who knew the full story, William Foster represented something more significant, proof that honor, courage, and compassion could still triumph over corruption and despair when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things in service of justice and human dignity.